November 1888. The Wind River Range, Wyoming Territory. Nobody noticed what was happening in that shallow cave 3 miles west of the settlement. From the outside, it looked reckless, a woman's bedroll disappearing into raw stone each night. Inside, it was something else entirely, something that would rewrite what the high country understood about winter. By the time the blizzard of '88 arrived, Martha Hewitt had been sleeping in that cave for 47 nights. People had opinions. They always did. But Martha wasn't building a statement. She was building a chance. What she understood about stone, air, and fire would prove itself when the temperature dropped to 23 below zero and stayed there for 11 days straight. This is the story of the worst idea that became the only one that mattered. If you want to see a survival technique that actually worked when life depended on it, subscribe now. Every week, we bring you one method that stood the test when everything else failed. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this technique works anywhere stone and cold meet. Martha Hewitt wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She was a seamstress by trade, 29 years old, living in a single-room timber cabin at the edge of the Wind River settlement. The cabin had been her husband's before typhoid took him the previous spring. It came with a stone hearth, a pine board floor, and a mortgage she couldn't afford to lose. The problem was simple. The cabin bled heat. Every piece of firewood she fed into that hearth disappeared into the November wind within hours. The floor stayed cold enough to freeze water in a tin cup overnight. By morning, frost formed on the inside of the door, and her breath hung visible even 3 feet from the fire. She was burning through a week's worth of split pine every 4 days, and her woodpile was already half gone. The math didn't work. She had fuel for maybe 6 more weeks if she was careful. Winter in the Wind River Range lasted until late March. That left her short by 10 weeks minimum, and she had no money to buy more and no strength to fell timber alone in snow that would soon reach her waist. She needed a solution that didn't cost anything. 300 yards behind her cabin, a limestone outcrop rose 30 feet above the valley floor. At its base, a shallow cave, more of an overhang really, cut back into the rock about 12 feet deep and 9 feet wide. The opening faced southeast, sheltered from the prevailing northwest wind by the stone mass itself. Martha had used it for storage in summer, kept her mill cold. Notice the temperature inside stayed stable even when the air outside swung 40 degrees between noon and midnight. One morning in early November, she walked into that cave with a wool blanket, a candle, and a simple question. What if she slept here instead? The answer came by dawn. The cave held 58 degrees Fahrenheit through the night, while her cabin dropped to 34. She hadn't lit a fire. She hadn't burned a single log. The stone itself was the stove. That's when she stopped sleeping in the cabin. By the 3rd night, she'd moved her bedroll, a small trunk, and a clay oil lamp into the cave. By the end of the 1st week, she'd hung a canvas tarp across the opening to cut the draft, leaving a 2-foot gap at the top for air. By the 2nd week, she positioned a ring of river stones just inside the entrance and started a small fire there each evening. Not for heat, but to warm the limestone. The rock soaked it in, held it, and radiated it back through the night. She woke warm. She used 1/10 the wood. And every day, her woodpile stretched a little further into spring. But nobody else saw it that way. What Martha built wasn't complicated. It was just invisible to people who never needed to see it. The cave was shallow, yes, but that was the advantage. 12 feet of depth meant the interior stayed within the thermal mass of the surrounding limestone. That stone, millions of years old and dense as bone, held temperature the way a lake holds water. Slow to heat, slow to cool, stable. The southeast-facing entrance caught the low winter sun from about 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Those 5 hours of direct light warmed the stone floor and the interior walls to around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the sun dropped, the limestone released that stored heat gradually, radiating it back into the enclosed space for hours. At night, Martha built a small fire just inside the entrance, never more than a double armload of sticks, sometimes less. The flames heated the stone ring she'd positioned there, and that ring became a secondary heat battery. The warm air from the fire rose and circulated along the cave ceiling, transferred its energy to the limestone overhead, and then descended cooler along the walls. Convection in a stone loop. The canvas tarp sheet hung stopped wind, but allowed ventilation through the top gap. Cold air slid in low, was warmed by the radiating stone, and rose to replace the escaping warm air. Continuous exchange without draft. No smoke buildup. No suffocation risk. The system was passive. Once she'd positioned the stones and hung the tarp, it required nothing from her except a handful of firewood and the discipline not to overdo it. More fire didn't mean more warmth. It meant wasted fuel and temperature swings. The cave wanted consistency, and consistency came from stone, not flame. She kept her bedroll on a low wooden platform she'd built from scrap pine, lifting herself 8 inches off the cave floor. Cold air settled below her. Warm air pooled at shoulder height. She slept in the thermal pocket the limestone created, insulated by wool and physics. Inside that cave, with outside temperatures dropping into the teens, Martha maintained an overnight range between 52 and 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Comfortable enough to sleep without shivering. Warm enough that frost never formed on her blankets. And she did it burning a quarter cord of wood per week, while her neighbors burned a full cord or more. But the technique looked strange. A woman, alone, sleeping in a hole in the ground. It didn't fit the image of respectable survival. It didn't look like progress. It looked like retreat, like poverty, like desperation dressed up as a plan. And people talked. The first comment came from Samuel Dobbs, a carpenter who'd built half the cabins in the valley. He was hauling cut pine past her property in mid-November when he saw the tarps strung across the cave, opening and Martha emerging with her blanket roll at dawn. He didn't say it to her face. He said it to Dutch Crenshaw at the mill 2 days later. She's living in a damn hole now. Hewitt's widow, sleeping in the rock like some kind of animal. Won't last the winter that way. Dutch nodded, repeated it at the trading post. By the end of the week, it was common knowledge, spoken with the casual certainty people use when they're sure someone else is making a mistake they'd never make. She's gone strange since he died. Can't be safe, sleeping in there. What if the rock shifts? It's no way for a Christian woman to live. Nobody asked her why. Nobody came to see the setup. They just assumed she'd lost her sense along with her husband, and that winter would correct her soon enough. Even the women, who might have understood scarcity better than the men, kept a polite distance. Mary Callahan, who lived a quarter-mile south, mentioned it once while mending a torn skirt Martha had brought in for repair. "You know people are talking, don't you?" Martha nodded, kept her needle moving. "They say you're sleeping outside now, in the rocks." "I'm sleeping warm," Martha said. "That's all that matters." Mary wanted to say more. You could see it in her face. But she didn't. She just folded the skirt, handed it back, and changed the subject to the price of flour. There was no anger in the judgment. No cruelty. Just the steady, quiet pressure of a community that had decided what normal looked like. And Martha wasn't it. Samuel Dobbs walked past her property again in early December. Saw her carrying an armload of sticks toward the cave in the late afternoon. He shook his head, slow and certain, and kept walking. Waste of time, he muttered to himself. She'll be knocking on doors by January, begging for a real roof. But January came, and she didn't knock. She woke every morning in that cave, used less firewood than anyone in the valley, and kept her cabin mortgage paid with the seamstress work she did by daylight. The stone kept her warm. The system worked, and nobody noticed because nobody was measuring. Not yet. The blizzard arrived on January 9th, 1889. It came without ceremony. No dramatic skies, no animal warnings. Just a shift in the wind at dawn and snow by mid-morning. Soft at first, then heavier, then relentless. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, it was 6. By midnight, it was below 0, and the wind was tearing through the valley at sustained speeds near 40 miles per hour with gusts that shook cabin walls and ripped shingles loose. The snow didn't stop. It fell for 3 days straight, piling 4 feet deep in the open ground and drifting 8 feet high against anything that blocked the wind. The temperature never climbed above 0 during daylight. At night, it dropped to 15 below, then 18, then 23. It stayed that cold for 11 days. The settlement buckled under it. Chimneys choked with ice and backdrafted smoke into cabins. Firewood, stacked outside and exposed, soaked through with snow and refused to light. People burned green pine, furniture, floorboards, anything that would catch. Some cabins burned through a week's worth of fuel in a single night, trying to keep the interior above freezing. Dutch Crenshaw's family moved into his workshop because the chimney in their cabin failed completely. The Tolliver children slept 3 to a bed under every quilt the family owned and still woke with frost on their hair. Samuel Dobbs burned his back porch, board by board, to keep his hearth alive. People stopped going outside except to grab firewood or check on neighbors. The wind cut exposed skin in seconds. Frostbite took toes, fingers, earlobes. 2 elderly settlers in the outer homesteads didn't make it. Hypothermia, the doctor said later, when the thaw finally came and they could reach the bodies. And in the middle of it all, Martha Hewitt walked out of her cave every morning, collected a single armload of dry kindling from the small shelter she'd built near the entrance, and went about her day. Because inside that cave, the temperature never dropped below 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The limestone didn't care about the storm. It held its thermal mass the way it had for millennia, insulated by millions of tons of surrounding stone and earth. The blizzard winds screamed past the entrance, but the tarp deflected them, and the cave's orientation kept the worst gusts from penetrating. The small fire she built each evening, still just a double armload of sticks, warmed the stone ring, and that warmth radiated into the space for hours. She slept through the coldest nights of the century in relative comfort, while a quarter-mile away, families huddled together burning everything they owned. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove her right. It humiliated every assumption the valley had made about survival. The discovery didn't come from Martha. It came from necessity. On the 7th day of the blizzard, Mary Callahan's husband, Joseph, made his way through waist-deep snow to check on the widow Hewitt. He expected to find her desperate, maybe injured, possibly worse. The settlement had a quiet duty to its own, and a woman living alone in a cave during the worst cold in living memory seemed like an obvious casualty waiting to be confirmed. He found her splitting kindling outside the cave entrance, her breath visible but her movements steady and unhurried. "You all right, Mrs. Hewitt?" She looked up, surprised to see him. "I'm fine, Joseph." "You?" He stared at her for a moment, then at the cave opening behind her, then at the small, neat stack of firewood beside the entrance, barely touched. His own family had burned through their entire woodpile and started on the lumber from a shed. He'd walked 300 yards through killing cold to check on a woman who looked warmer than he'd been in a week. "How much wood are you burning?" Martha gestured at the stack. "About the same as before, maybe a little more on the coldest nights." Joseph did the math in his head. That stack represented maybe a quarter cord. He'd burned 2 full cords in the last 6 days. "Can I see inside?" She stepped aside. He ducked under the tarp and stopped just past the threshold. The air inside wasn't hot. It was merely not cold. 50-something degrees, he guessed. 55, maybe. Cool enough to see your breath if you exhaled hard, but warm enough that you didn't feel the immediate bite of winter. The stone walls radiated a gentle, even heat. No drafts, no ice, no desperation. A clay lamp burned on a small wooden crate. Her bedroll lay neatly folded on a raised platform. A tin cup sat beside a water jug that showed no sign of freezing. "Jesus," he said quietly. "Physics," Martha replied from the entrance. "The stone does most of the work." Joseph Callahan went home and told his wife. Mary told the Tollivers. The Tollivers told Dutch Crenshaw. By the time the blizzard finally broke on January 20th, half the settlement knew that Martha Hewitt had survived the worst cold in 95 years, burning less wood in 11 days than most families burned in 2. People started measuring. Samuel Dobbs, who'd called it a waste of time, walked out to the cave himself 3 days after the thaw began. He brought a thermometer. The outside air read 21 degrees Fahrenheit at 9 a.m. inside the cave. With no fire burning and the morning sun just starting to hit the entrance, The temperature read 52 degrees. 31 degrees warmer. No active heat source. Just stone. He stood there for a long time, looking at the mercury, then at the limestone walls, then back at the thermometer. How much wood did you use? Total. During the cold stretch. Martha had kept account. About a cord and a quarter. 11 days. Dobbs had burned 4 cords in the same period. His cabin had never stayed above 40 degrees inside, even with the hearth roaring day and night. He'd lost 3 windows to ice pressure. His children had coughed through the entire ordeal, and his wife had developed chilblains on both feet from the cold floor. And this woman, sleeping in a cave, had used 70% less fuel and stayed warmer. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit he'd been wrong. He just asked, very carefully, how she'd positioned the stones and hung the tarp. The comparisons spread by word of mouth. Martha's cave, 48 to 61 degrees overnight, a quarter cord per week, no frozen water, no ice on the walls, no smoke damage, no wasted fuel. Standard cabins, 28 to 42 degrees overnight, 1 to 2 cords per week, constant fire tending, frozen floors, chilblains, coughs, and a constant race against depleting wood piles. By February, people stopped calling it strange. They started calling it smart. The shift happened quietly, the way most real changes do. In late February, Dutch Crenshaw walked out to the limestone outcrop a half-mile from his property and started clearing brush from a similar overhang. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask permission. He just started digging out the interior, widening the space, and positioning a stone ring near the entrance the way Martha had. By March, he'd moved his sleeping area into the rock. His family stayed in the cabin during the day, but at night, he and his 2 sons slept in the overhang. They burned half the wood they'd used before and woke without frost on their blankets. Mary Callahan's family did something different. They didn't have a cave, but they had a root cellar built into the hillside behind their cabin. Joseph widened the entrance, dug the interior back another 6 feet into the slope, and lined the walls with river stones. He installed a small vented stove at the threshold and moved the children's beds down into the space. The earth insulation combined with the stone mass kept the cellar a stable 53 degrees through the remainder of winter. The kids slept warm. The family's wood consumption dropped by 60%. Samuel Dobbs didn't copy the cave. He had too much pride for that. But he did something quieter. He started building his cabins differently. When he framed the Kowalski place that spring, he positioned the hearth against an interior stone wall that he built thicker and deeper than standard. 18 inches of stacked limestone running floor to ceiling. He told Kowalski it was for draft efficiency. It was for thermal mass. By the winter of 1890, 7 families within a 15-mile radius had either moved sleeping quarters into stone overhangs, expanded root cellars into insulated sleeping spaces, or integrated heavy stone walls into their cabin hearths. None of them called it Martha's method. They just called it practical. The technique didn't spread because of persuasion. It spread because it worked and because winter doesn't care about pride. When the cold comes, you either adapt or you suffer. The people who adapted survived more comfortably. The people who didn't learned. Martha kept sleeping in her cave through the winter of 1890 and into 1891. By then, she'd improved the design. She'd added a second tarp layer with a 6-inch air gap for additional insulation. She'd built a small stone partition near the entrance to block direct wind without cutting ventilation. She'd positioned flat stones along the cave ceiling to capture and radiate heat downward more efficiently. In the spring of 1891, she sold the timber cabin and its mortgage, used the money to buy a small parcel near the limestone outcrop, and built a hybrid structure, half stone dugout, half timber frame. The sleeping area sat 8 feet into the hillside, backed by limestone bedrock. The day area, framed in pine, faced south with wide windows for light. She heated the entire structure with less than half the wood a standard cabin required. People stopped visiting out of curiosity. They started visiting to learn. What Martha Hewitt understood wasn't complicated. It was just invisible to people who never needed to see it. Stone holds heat. Earth insulates. Orientation matters. Thermal mass works whether you believe in it or not. She didn't invent any of this. Indigenous peoples across the Americas had used similar techniques for thousands of years. Earth lodges, pit houses, cliff dwellings, stone-lined winter shelters. The physics were ancient. The wisdom was ancient. Martha just remembered what industrial culture had started to forget, that the best shelter isn't always the one that looks most impressive. Sometimes it's the one that works with the cold instead of fighting it. The blizzard of 1889 didn't teach the Wind River Valley anything new. It just made them pay attention to what was already true. By 1895, stone-backed hearths, insulated root cellars, and hillside dugouts had become common features in high-country construction across Wyoming and Montana. The techniques weren't revolutionary. They were just effective. And effectiveness, tested by survival, becomes tradition. Martha Hewitt lived in that stone and timber house until 1923. She died at 64, outliving most of her critics. The house still stands, though it's been modified and expanded over the decades. The original cave behind it remains dry, stable, and still holding a temperature of 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside air, even in the dead of winter. No fire needed, just stone, time, and the patience to let physics do the work. The people who laughed didn't learn from theory. They learned from temperature, from wood consumption, from the simple, undeniable fact that one woman, sleeping in a hole in the ground, survived the worst cold in living memory more comfortably than families in well-built cabins. That's not folklore. That's engineering. And engineering, when it's honest, doesn't care what it looks like. It only cares if it works. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment and tell us. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? And if you want more techniques like this, methods that actually worked when survival wasn't optional, hit subscribe. Every week, we bring you one piece of forgotten wisdom that stood the test when everything else failed. Like this video, if stone, fire, and physics make more sense than modern comfort. We'll see you in the next one. Educational note. This script is educational and historical in nature. It does not substitute for professional engineering consultation, building codes, or safety standards. Any attempt to replicate historical shelter techniques should be undertaken with proper research, permits, and safety precautions appropriate to your region and circumstances.